Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're going deep into code-switching speech recognition.
Uh-huh.
It's basically where AI tries to figure out how people mix languages, like when you throw in a Spanish phrase while speaking English.
Right.
Okay, so you've given us like a ton of research papers, articles, even some code.
Yeah.
It seems like you really want to understand how code-switching speech recognition works,
Mm-hmm.
the different ways researchers are tackling this,
Yeah.
and what it might look like down the road.
For sure, it's a really interesting area.
Where do we even start with all this?
Well, one of the most fascinating things is just how many different approaches there are.
Okay.
Like, we see everything from mapping words to using these complex language models,
Mm-hmm.
and even some really cool deep learning techniques like speech collage.
Speech collage.
Yeah.
That sounds more like art class than AI.
Mm-hmm. Right.
What is that?
It's basically this clever way to get more data,
Okay.
because code switching speech recognition needs a ton of data to learn.
Yeah, makes sense.
So researchers basically take pieces of audio from different languages, like English and Mandarin,
Mhm.
and they kind of splice them together to make these new examples of code-switched speech.
So they're like making a Frankenstein monster out of audio.
Uh-huh. Kind of.
And that works.
Surprisingly, yeah.
Yeah.
It helps the AI pick up on the patterns of code-switched speech, even if there's not much natural data to work with.
That's pretty wild.
But before we get too into the techie stuff,
Okay.
maybe we should take a step back.
Yeah, good idea.
Can you explain what code switching actually is?
Right.
And why it's so hard for AI to grasp?
Yeah, that's a good point.
I mean, I know I do it all the time,
Me too.
but I never really thought about how tricky it must be for a computer to understand.
Yeah.
So code switching is really just when someone switches between languages in a conversation. It could be a word or a phrase or even whole sentences.
Right.
The problem for AI is that those traditional speech recognition systems, they're trained on data from just one language at a time. So when they run into code-switched speech, it's like they short circuit. It's like trying to read a book that suddenly jumps from English to Spanish and back again. It just doesn't compute.
That makes sense.
So how are researchers tackling this, you ask?
Yeah, where do they even begin?
Well, one of the early approaches was this idea of word mapping.
Okay.
It's kind of like making this giant bilingual dictionary for code-switched speech.
Interesting.
Researchers use massive amounts of translated text and then tools to find matching words and phrases.
So if I said Tengo hambre,
Yeah.
the system would link that to I am hungry in English.
Exactly.
Okay.
But it's not always that simple.
Right.
One study actually pointed out how a single English word can have a bunch of different translations depending on the context.
Yeah, context is everything.
Exactly.
Like bank could mean a place to keep your money or the edge of a river.
That's a great example.
So how did they deal with that?
That's where language models come in,
Okay.
particularly ones focused on Mandarin. They basically analyze the translated sentences to see if they sound natural, like
Right.
are they grammatically correct.
Gotcha.
And this helps pick the best translation out of a bunch of possibilities.
Makes sense.
But it gets even more complex than that.
Oh, I bet.
We're seeing some crazy innovations in deep learning these days.
Like what?
Well, for instance, transformer networks are becoming super popular for this.
Transformers. Like the robots.
Not quite,
Okay.
but they are pretty amazing.
What did they do?
So they use this thing called multi-head attention,
Mm-hmm.
and this lets them focus on different parts of a sentence all at the same time.
Wow.
Like they can see the whole conversation, not just individual words.
So they're not just like looking up words in a dictionary.
No, not at all.
They're actually trying to understand the meaning and how the words relate to each other.
Exactly.
That's so cool.
Researchers are even designing special parts of these transformer models
Okay.
called encoders and decoders
Mm-hmm.
that are specific to certain languages.
So one model can handle a bunch of languages.
Yeah, switching between them as needed.
That's incredible.
It is.
So are we talking about training one AI on all these different languages, or are there separate AIs for each one?
That's a great question, and it leads to this idea of transfer learning and pre-trained models.
Okay.
So instead of starting from scratch with every language, you can take a model that's already been trained on a massive amount of data in one language, like English,
Okay.
and then fine-tune it on a smaller data set of code-switched speech.
Ah, so it's like giving the AI a head start.
Yeah.
Does that actually work?
Yeah, it does. It's been shown to really boost performance, especially when you don't have a ton of code switch data.
Interesting.
And this is really important in Southeast Asia, where code switching is everywhere.
Right.
But resources for developing this kind of language tech can be limited.
You mentioned Southeast Asia.
Yeah.
I've heard there's some cool research happening over there.
Oh, absolutely.
What's going on?
Well, Southeast Asia is kind of a hotbed for code switching research.
How so?
Well, think about it.
Okay.
There's so much linguistic diversity,
Yep.
with hundreds of languages and dialects spoken across all those different countries.
Hmm.
And code switching is just baked into the culture. It's how people talk.
Makes sense.
So this has led to resources like the SEAMI corpus.
See me? Like the sea.
Haha, it stands for Southeast Asian Mandarin English.
Okay.
It's this huge collection of transcribed audio data specifically for Mandarin English code-switched speech,
Wow.
a goldmine for training AI in that region.
That sounds super valuable.
It is.
Any interesting findings from that research?
Yeah, definitely.
Like what?
One study using the SEAMI corpus found that certain grammatical structures are way more common in casual code-switched conversation.
Oh, interesting.
And this just highlights how important it is to have data that reflects how people actually talk.
Real world stuff.
Right, exactly.
So are they using any special techniques with this data?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
What are they doing?
One technique that's getting popular is minimum word error training, or MWE.
Okay.
It's all about getting the AI to focus on making the transcription super accurate.
So instead of just guessing the next word, it's trying to get the whole sentence right.
Exactly.
Ah.
And they're even using these masking techniques at those tricky code switching points
Okay.
to help the AI understand the context better.
So it's like a puzzle for the AI to solve.
Yeah, kinda.
This is all so fascinating.
It is, right.
We've covered so much.
We have.
From basic word mapping to these super complex deep learning models.
Yeah.
Where is all this research going?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, the ultimate goal, the holy grail, is to create a universal model that can just understand any combination of languages.
Wow.
Imagine a world where you could talk to anyone, anywhere, and be perfectly understood.
That's the dream.
Right. No matter what languages you speak.
That would be incredible.
It
No more awkward hand gestures or trying to remember phrases from a guidebook.
Exactly.
How close are we to that?
We're making progress, but it's still a pretty huge goal.
Makes sense.
But one really promising area is the development of what we call configurable multilingual models, or CMMs.
CMMs.
Yeah.
What are those?
So these are AI models that you can customize to recognize speech from any mix of languages that the user chooses.
So it's like a universal remote control for understanding language.
That's a great analogy.
Cool.
It's all about giving people the flexibility to communicate naturally no matter what their language background is.
This is blowing my mind.
Uh-huh.
It sounds like we're on the verge of a linguistic revolution in AI.
It really does feel that way.
But before we get too carried away with the future,
Right.
let's bring it back to the present.
Okay.
Is any of this tech actually being used in our daily lives?
Oh, absolutely.
It is.
Yeah. Code switching, speech recognition is already powering some pretty amazing things.
Really?
Yeah.
Like what?
Well, one big area is virtual assistants.
Like being able to talk to Siri or Alexa in multiple languages.
Exactly.
Cool.
A lot of the popular assistants are being designed with code switching abilities now.
That makes them much more user-friendly, especially in multilingual homes or communities.
Exactly. It just makes sense.
What other areas are being changed by this technology?
Well, meeting transcription is another big one.
Okay.
You know, services are popping up that can transcribe meetings where people are naturally switching between languages.
That's so helpful.
Right.
No more relying on someone to try and write everything down in real time.
It's a game changer for international business and academic conferences, for sure.
What about something like social media?
Oh, for sure.
It's being used there.
Absolutely.
Wow.
AI that can understand code-switched content is being used to analyze what people are saying online.
So what, like figuring out what people are thinking and feeling?
Yeah, things like figuring out public sentiment, tracking trends, and even identifying potentially harmful content.
So it's not just about understanding what we're saying,
Right.
but what we mean when we say it.
Exactly.
Even when we're mixing languages online.
They've all connected.
This is wild.
It is, and it leads to some really important questions about the future of all this.
Okay, let's talk about the future.
All right.
What are some of the big challenges and opportunities on the horizon?
Well, one ongoing challenge is data scarcity.
Oh, right. We talked about that.
Even with all these fancy data augmentation tricks, the amount of real-world code switch data is still pretty limited.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense.
especially for less common language pairs.
So even though we're creating synthetic data, there's still no substitute for the real thing.
That's right.
Okay.
Another big hurdle is just the computational complexity of these models.
Right.
Even though researchers are trying to make them more efficient, handling large-scale code switching still takes a lot of computing power.
Yeah, not everyone has a supercomputer at home.
Exactly.
So we need to find a balance between performance and accessibility.
Absolutely.
What else?
And of course, we can't forget about the ethical implications.
Right.
As this tech gets more powerful, we need to be careful about potential biases
Mm-hmm.
and make sure these systems are fair and work for everyone.
Those are all important points.
They are.
It seems like there's a lot of work ahead, both on the technical and ethical sides.
There is a lot of work to be done.
But before we wrap up,
Yeah.
I'm curious about the potential impact of all this on society as a whole.
That's a big question and one researchers are really wrestling with right now.
Well, let's speculate a little.
Okay.
What are some ways code-switching speech recognition could change the world?
Well, imagine a world where language barriers basically don't exist.
Wow.
You could travel to any country and just have a normal conversation with anyone, no matter what language they speak.
That would be amazing.
It would be incredible.
No more awkward misunderstandings
Right.
relying on translators.
Exactly. It could revolutionize education. Students could access information and learn from teachers around the world.
That's cool.
And think about the possibilities for global collaboration in business, research, diplomacy.
Yeah, the potential to connect with people and understand each other better is huge.
It really
A
is.
beautiful vision. But are there any downsides we need to watch out for?
Of course, like any powerful technology, there are always risks.
Like what?
Well, some people worry about jobs, like translators and interpreters,
Right.
as those services become more automated.
That's a valid concern. We need to think about the economic and social effects of all this
We do.
and make sure the benefits are shared with everyone.
Absolutely.
What else?
Another worry is the possibility of misuse.
Okay.
Imagine governments or corporations using this technology to listen in on conversations and censor them.
Yeah, that's not good.
It highlights why we need strong ethical guidelines and regulations to prevent abuse.
Absolutely.
We have to be proactive in thinking about the risks and working to minimize them as this technology develops.
That's a great point.
It's something we have to be mindful of.
This has been an incredible deep dive.
It has been interesting.
We've gone from the basics of code switching to the cutting-edge research
You covered a lot of ground.
and even speculated about the future.
It's exciting stuff.
It's clear this technology could change the world in big ways, for better or worse.
It's a powerful tool, and it's up to us to use it responsibly.
Well said.
Yeah.
And on that note, we'll wrap up this episode of The Deep Dive. Thanks for joining us on this fascinating journey into the world of code-switching speech recognition. Be sure to check out the show notes for links to some of the research we discussed today. Until next time, keep driving deep.
It really is. But even with all this progress, building these systems, it's not exactly a piece of cake.
I can imagine.
One of the biggest challenges is how to handle code switching on a massive scale.
Yeah, like on social media or with huge data sets.
Exactly.
We've talked about needing lots of data.
Right.
But I bet things get even more complex when you have millions of conversations all happening at once.
Oh, absolutely. You need a way to process all that data without, needing a supercomputer.
Right, so it's about finding that sweet spot between being accurate and being efficient.
That's it.
Are there any other
Yeah.
approaches they're looking at?
Yeah, for sure. Another focus is developing smarter algorithms, ones that can really analyze and understand that code switch data on a larger scale.
So like tools that can sift through tons of social media posts and figure out how people are using language.
Exactly. It's not just about building a better AI. It's
Mhm.
about building the right tools to manage all that information, too.
You're right, it's a whole team effort.
It is.
Researchers, engineers, data scientists, all working together.
And it's not just the algorithms.
Okay.
The whole data infrastructure needs to be robust enough to handle all that code switch data.
Data infrastructure.
Yeah.
What's that? Like the plumbing of the internet.
Uh-huh. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. We need systems that can store and process this data effectively,
Okay.
especially as it keeps growing like crazy.
Right, it's not just building a smart AI.
Mm-hmm.
It's building a whole ecosystem to support it.
You got it. And this kind of brings us back to those real-world applications we were talking about.
Yeah, like what are some examples of that?
Well, virtual assistants are a big one.
Right, like being able to talk to your Siri or Alexa in multiple languages without them freaking out.
Exactly.
Makes sense.
A lot of the popular assistants are designed to handle code switching now.
It just makes them so much easier to use.
For sure, especially for people in multilingual homes or communities.
Totally.
It just makes sense.
What else is changing because of this?
Meeting transcription is another big
Yeah.
one. There are services popping up that can transcribe meetings where people are naturally switching back and forth between languages.
No more trying to scribble everything down in real time.
Exactly.
That's amazing.
Right. It's a game changer for international business and conferences.
I bet.
Huge for academics, too.
What about social media?
Oh, yeah. Definitely AI that understands code-switched content is being used to analyze what people are talking about online.
So like figuring out what people think and feel.
Yeah, things like analyzing public sentiment, tracking trends, and even spotting potentially harmful content.
Wow. So it's not just understanding what we're saying, it's understanding what we mean,
That's right.
even when we're mixing up languages online.
It's all connected.
That's wild.
It is, right? And it raises some really big questions about the future of all this.
Okay, let's talk about the future then. What are some of the challenges and opportunities out there?
Well, one of the biggest challenges is still data scarcity.
Oh yeah, even with the data augmentation stuff.
Even with all that, yeah. The amount of real-world code switch data is still pretty limited.
Especially for those less common language pairs.
Right, exactly.
So even though we're getting better at creating synthetic data, nothing beats the real thing.
You got it. And then there's the computational side of things. Even though researchers are working on making these models more efficient, they still take a lot of computing power to handle code switching on a large scale.
Right. Most people don't have a supercomputer just lying around.
Exactly. So we need to strike that balance between performance and making it accessible to everyone.
What else?
And of course, we can't forget about the ethics of all this.
That's right. The ethical side is huge.
As this tech gets more powerful, we need to be really careful about potential biases and make sure these systems are fair and inclusive.
Yeah, those are all really important points.
They are. There's a lot to consider.
It seems like there's a ton of work to do, both on the tech side and the ethical side.
There's lots to figure out.
But before we wrap up,
Yeah.
I'm curious about the bigger picture. What kind of impact could all this have on society as a whole?
That's the million-dollar question, and one that researchers are really grappling with right now.
Well, let's speculate a little. What are some ways code-switching speech recognition could change the world?
Well, just imagine a world where language barriers basically don't exist.
Wow.
You could travel to any country and have a normal conversation with anyone, no matter what language they speak.
That would be incredible.
Right. No more awkward misunderstandings or having to rely on translators.
What else?
Think about education. Students could learn from teachers all over the world.
That would be amazing.
And then there's global collaboration, business, research, diplomacy. The potential to connect and understand each other better is huge.
It really is a beautiful vision.
It is. But of course, there are also potential downsides to think about.
Right, like what?
Well, some people are worried about jobs, like translators and interpreters.
Yeah, as these services become more automated.
Exactly. So we need to think about the economic and social impacts.
We do.
And make sure the benefits are shared with everyone.
That's important.
It is.
Yeah.
And then there's the potential for misuse.
Okay, like what do you mean?
Imagine governments or corporations using this technology to monitor and censor conversations across different languages.
Yeah, that's a scary thought. We definitely need some safeguards in place.
We do. Strong ethical guidelines and regulations are going to be key.
Absolutely.
We have to be proactive about thinking through the risks and working to minimize them as this technology keeps developing.
That's a great point. It's
Yeah.
something we all need to be aware of.
For sure.
This has been an incredible deep dive.
It has. We've covered a lot.
We went from understanding the basics of code switching to exploring the cutting-edge research and even thinking about what the future holds.
It's exciting stuff.
It really is. It's clear that this technology has the power to change the world in some big ways, both good and bad.
It's a powerful tool, and it's up to us to use it wisely.
Well said. And on that note, we'll wrap up this episode of The Deep Dive. Thanks for joining us on this fascinating journey into the world of code-switching speech recognition. Be sure to check out the show notes for links to some of the research we discussed today. Until next time, keep diving deep. It really has been fascinating. And like you said, with any new tech, there are always those potential downsides to think about. It's like opening Pandora's box, right?
Exactly. And one thing that always comes up with AI is bias.
Oh yeah, bias. How does that play into code-switching speech recognition?
It's a great question. We've talked about how these systems learn from the data they're given.
Mm-hmm.
But what if that data itself has biases baked in?
Right. Like what happens then?
Well, it's like teaching a kid with biased textbooks.
Hmm.
The AI can end up just repeating those biases or even making them worse.
That makes sense.
For example, if a system is mostly trained on formal code switching,
Uh-huh.
it might not understand how people actually talk in casual settings.
So it's not just about having a lot of data.
Right.
It's about having the right kind of data
Exactly. It needs to be diverse.
and reflect the real world.
Precisely. And this can have some real consequences. Think about a virtual assistant that only understands certain accents
Oh,
or dialects. It creates all sorts of inequality.
yeah, it's like the AI is judging you based on how you speak.
Right, exactly. So it's super important to make sure these systems are trained on data that reflects the real world with all its quirks and variations.
So diverse data is key
It's essential.
to making AI that's fair for everyone.
Absolutely. And another big challenge is just the complexity of code switching itself.
Yeah. I mean, we do it without even thinking,
We do.
but getting a machine to understand all those subtle rules and patterns,
It's tough.
it's incredibly hard.
Yeah, it's like we're trying to teach a computer to not just be bilingual,
Uh-huh.
but to be multilingual and to seamlessly switch between all those languages.
Oh, and to know when to switch.
Exactly. And it gets even trickier
How so?
because those rules can change depending on the languages,
Yeah.
the social context, even the individual speaker.
Wow, that's a lot for an AI to handle.
It is. It's a big challenge.
Are there any specific areas where you think we need to see more progress?
One area I'm really interested in is personalization.
Okay.
What if you had a system that learned how you code switch
Yeah,
and adapted to your own style and preferences?
that would be amazing. Like it
Yeah.
really gets you.
Right.
It would feel much more natural.
Absolutely. And what about something like emotional intelligence?
Ooh, interesting.
Could we build AI that understands not just the words,
Mm-hmm.
but the feelings behind them?
Wow, even in code-switched speech.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Imagine a virtual therapist that can pick up on those subtle emotional cues,
Yeah.
no matter what languages you're using.
That's wild.
Or a customer service bot that can de-escalate a tense situation in a culturally sensitive way.
The possibilities are pretty mind-blowing.
They are. It's a really exciting area of research.
It feels like we're just scratching the surface of what's possible.
We are. There's so much more to explore.
Well, before we get too carried away thinking about the future,
Right.
let's take a minute to recap what we've learned today.
Okay, sounds good.
We started by looking at the basics of code switching
Right.
and why it's such a challenge for AI. Then we dug into the different approaches researchers are using, from word mapping to deep learning and data augmentation.
All those different techniques.
And we talked about how important it is to have diverse data.
And the ethical considerations.
Yeah, building systems that are fair and work for everyone.
Those are crucial.
And then we even got to think about some of the amazing possibilities for the future.
Like those personalized models and emotionally intelligent AI.
It's been a wild ride.
It has.
We've gone from the nuts and bolts to the bigger picture. The impact of all this.
Yeah, it's fascinating how code switching speech recognition touches on so many different things.
It really does. It shows the power of language.
And how technology can help us break down barriers and connect with each other in new ways.
That's a great way to put it. Well, on that note, we'll wrap up this episode of The Deep Dive. Thanks for joining us on this exploration into the fascinating world of code switching speech recognition. Until next time, keep diving deep.